Okay guys, welcome back to another AP World History video lecture. Today we're going to be talking about the collapse of empires. So at the beginning of the 20th century, we saw really a massive change in global powers and governments. We tend to think that we're going through a lot of change today, and we are. But the beginning of the 20th century saw massive empires that had been around for a long time all of a sudden collapse. This included the Qing Chinese Dynasty, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Tsar that changed to communism. The closest idea that we could come to this would be like if countries today, like the United States, Britain, or China, just folded away into something new. So the big question is, why did all this happen? And why did it happen so quickly in that short period of time, basically from around 1900 to 1930? So here's my argument. I think the collapse was really an effect of imperial and industrial competition over lands for raw resources. Countries that had been influenced by European powers either chose to become their own imperial powers, or they fell in the competition. So let's start up with our first example, the Ottoman Empire. It was founded in about 1300 CE, and it lasted all the way up to World War I. That's 600 years. Many people have argued that the Ottomans were on a slow decline for centuries, but that's really kind of questionable. The Ottomans controlled lands from modern-day Iraq to northern Africa. And remember that the Ottomans had created systems like the Millet, the Janissary Corps, the Devshirme, and Harem to manage a whole diversity of minority groups. The Ottomans had a very powerful navy, and they controlled massive trade routes from Europe through the Silk Roads out to India. All of this started to decline in the 1800s. Many of the Millets began to break away from the Ottomans because they wanted their own independent states and cultures. Places like Egypt, Serbia, and the Balkan states all broke away and started to create their own countries. This began to weaken the Ottomans. But the largest weakening came in 1853, in what was known as the Crimean War. See, Russia saw the Baltic area as their zone of protection. This was partially due to their belief that the culture there was kind of similar to the Russians. It was Eastern Christianity, and therefore under their protection. But for Russia, the real bigger issue was control over an area called the Dardanelles Straits, right around the area of Turkey, and its access to warm water ports. Russia decided to invade to take this over, and that triggered Britain and France to counter. They were not interested really in protecting the Ottomans. They just didn't want to see Russia gain access to those ports. The end of the war saw a huge loss for Russia. The Ottomans had to scale back their empire to modern-day Turkey. After this had happened, the Ottoman Empire kind of realized that they could only keep up if they adopted Western-style industrialization. So a group of reformers called the Young Turks came to power. They advocated for industrialization, limited government, freedom for religious minorities, and rights. Note that these reformers were attempting to model after Western technology and ideas in order to keep up with the competition. However, during World War I, the Young Turks chose to side with the Germans. And during the war, they turned on their own ideals. They even attacked the internal millet of the Armenians, claiming the Armenians were a cancer in the society. They, the Turks, killed 2 million Armenians in a massive genocide. At the end of the war, with the loss of the German side, the Turks also lost the Ottoman Empire. The Middle East was partitioned by the British and French victorious powers, and they created what was called the Mandate System, which led up to the current makeup of what we see of Middle Eastern countries. Okay, second big example is Russia. So Russia had been under the power of the Russian Tsar, and that Tsar had ruled ever since the beginnings of Russia. And the dominant family for the last 300 years had been the Romanovs. However, let's go back to that Crimean War. It had a huge impact. The Crimean War had this massive negative impact on Russia, as well as the Ottomans. The Russians lost the Crimean War. This got the Russian leadership to question what had gone wrong. The Tsar at the time was Tsar Nicholas I. He decided that the problem with Russia was its lack of industrialization. See, Britain and France showed up to war with mechanized weapons. Russia showed up with horses and carts. The bigger issue was that Russia had not let go of its system of serfs. The landowners in Russia did not want to give up their workers, and for good reason. They basically owned the serf class. Unlike in Western Europe, serfs in Russia were tied to their masters. This meant that they were almost like slaves. So Nicholas made a compromise. He promised emancipation for the serfs, but they had to pay their masters for freedom. Considering that serfs were dirt poor, this was not much of a compromise. So serfs remained serfs, even though the law had changed. The Russian Tsar was tested then in 1905. The workers in the cities rebelled throughout the empire. And then during a peaceful protest by women who wanted bread for their children, the Russian army fired upon the crowd, killing over 100 people. This event created a crisis for the Tsar. In response, Nicholas II created what was called the Duma, or the Russian Congress, to represent the interests of the people. The Duma met on several occasions throughout the early 1900s and kept the peace. However, the final straw came with Russia's entrance into World War I. Russia entered into the war as a part of its treaty obligation to Serbia. The Russian forces were losing most of the major battles, and by the end of the war, Russia would lose the most amount of people, 10 million. So Russia at the time was experiencing not just losses, but also natural famines during the war. Then Tsar Nicholas II dissolved the Duma, trying to retain his own power. The combination of losing the wartime battles and experiencing a lack of internal resources eventually led to an internal rebellion that ended the Tsar's reign. Now, this new government was a socialist one, not communist, and was led by Alexander Kerensky. It was called the Provisional Government. Well, there were a group of socialists who felt that this government didn't go far enough, and that was led by a man named I.V. Lenin. Lenin felt that they needed a Marxist revolution, a Marxist philosophy. Lenin wanted to see a utopian society form in Russia. But unlike Marx, he believed that the revolution would not be spontaneous. Rather, it needed an intellectual vanguard, a group of leaders who would kind of lead people into the revolution. Well, Lenin had been exiled by the Tsar years before, but the Germans saw an opportunity. Lenin was living in Germany at the time. They believed if they could get Lenin back into Russia, he would cause chaos, and maybe Russia would get out of the war. That's exactly what happened. The Germans sent Lenin back into Russia in a sealed train car. He got into the Russian farmlands and advocated for the redistribution of land and a Russian exit from the war. Lenin gained a massive following from the rural countryside. His followers, called the Bolsheviks, rebelled and toppled the provisional government. Then they took the Tsar's family and executed them. They then formed a new communist government based upon a central party and local Soviets. Okay, last major example is that of the Qing Dynasty in China. This was the last of the great Chinese dynasties, and it was amazing how quickly the fall came. The Qing Dynasty, led by Qianlong, had kicked the British out of China in 1793, when Ambassador Lord Macartney asked for free trade. Only 40 years later, in 1830, the British would come back. First, they began selling opium, yes, the drug opium, to the Chinese. This created massive cultural problems in the port cities. The foreign minister Lin Zexu closed the Chinese ports to the British trade. So the British came back with their navy in the Opium Wars and easily defeated what was the Chinese junk ships. After this loss, the Chinese leadership asked what had gone wrong. Their philosophers and political thinkers developed an answer to the question. Probably the key leader was a man named Kang Yawei. He formed the slogan East for Essence and West for Practical Use. The idea was that China could maintain its Confucian culture but adopt some Western technology for advancement, and this became a part of a movement that was called the Self-Strengthening Movement. However, the leader of the Qing Empire at the time, the Dowager Cixi, feared the loss of Confucian culture, so she said thanks to the thinkers and then imprisoned or killed them, and China remained an agricultural state. Well, the consequences were not all that good. See, soon after that, China lost a huge war. It's called the Sino-Japanese War in 1894. They lost their control over Korea, and they saw their power decline relative to Europe, the United States, and Japan. Plus, China saw two massive internal rebellions. After the Opium Wars in 1850 in the northern provinces, a poor farmer named Hong Xiaoquan claimed to be the long-lost brother of Jesus. He led a violent revolution against the Qing, claiming their corruption. He would lose, but between 20 to 70 million people died in that rebellion. So why is it important? Because it shows how in that revolution there was a diffusion of European ideas into China. Then in 1899, a group of traditional Confucianists fought a rebellion in the rural areas of China. These boxers saw themselves as battling against a Chinese dynasty that was becoming too westernized. During the 1890s, the Qing had to see it accepted an open door policy, an American-led effort to have China create trade zones to trade with different European and American groups. That's what triggered that Boxer Rebellion, the fear of incoming European and American ideas. All this eventually led to the collapse of the Qing Dynasty. A man named Dr. Sun Yat-sen advocated for China to become a Western-style democracy with a socialist economy. He started the Chinese Nationalist Party. The group ended up having two factions. One was led by Chiang Kai-shek, a nationalist who advocated for Western capitalism, and the other was Mao Zedong, who advocated for communism as a way to break away from Western imperialism. Okay, what are our three big takeaways this time around? First off, I want to start by talking about that the collapse of these empires, our first major takeaway, really comes in the context of industrialization and imperialism in the West. As these countries competed with one another, it caused a competition that led to a collapse of these major powers. Second major takeaway that you should take out of this. Countries that tended to do well at this time period oftentimes modeled themselves off of the imperialist powers. So Japan's a good example. Countries that didn't, like China, tended to collapse. Which brings up then to the third big takeaway to talk about. The third big takeaway is what we were left with after that. By the time that was done, you were left with one of two possibilities. Either the major Western powers were able to break up these fallen empires and rule them themselves, or you started to see radical new types of governments arise, like communist ones. Okay, see you in class.